April 28, 1946, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The dust hung thick in the air as 37 Japanese women stepped off the transport trucks, blinking against the brutal sunlight. They had been told to expect humiliation. They had been warned about American cruelty. What they got instead would shatter everything they believed about their captors. If you're watching this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one, and your stories help keep these histories alive. Now, let's continue. The women stood in a ragged line, barefoot on the scorched earth, their thin uniforms clinging to exhausted frames. Behind them, the war was over. Ahead of them, only uncertainty. The women tensed, preparing for the worst. Then he held it out, a cotton dress, pale blue with small white flowers. In that moment, everything they had been taught about the enemy began to unravel. The propaganda had been relentless. From 1942 onward, Japanese civilians and military personnel alike were bombarded with images of American barbarism. Posters depicted U.S. soldiers as demons with fangs, trampling women and children. Radio broadcasts warned that capture meant torture, violation, public humiliation. For the women who had served in the so-called comfort system, the warnings were even more specific. If the Americans take you, they will parade you naked through the streets. They will brand you. They will make you wish for death. These women had spent years trapped in a machinery of exploitation. They were nurses without medical training, assistants without agency, girls without voices. Some had been coerced with promises of factory work. Others had been outright kidnapped. All of them had been told it was their duty to the emperor. The phrase comfort women was itself a euphemism designed to obscure the truth that they were prisoners of a system that treated them as expendable. By 1945, as Japan's empire crumbled, these women became ghosts. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing surrender, some were. Others were simply abandoned, left in bombed-out buildings with no identification, no supplies, no way home. The U.S. military faced an unexpected challenge. Thousands of displaced Japanese civilians, including women who had been part of the military apparatus, needed to be processed, housed, fed. The logistics were staggering. Japanese nationals between 1945 and 1947. But numbers don't tell the human story. They don't explain what happened when ideology met reality on a dusty Texas ranch. The transport ship that carried the women across the Pacific was a converted cargo vessel. Below deck, the air was thick with diesel fumes and fear. The women huddled together, speaking in whispers, clutching what few possessions they had salvaged. Another gripped a small wooden comb, the only thing she had managed to keep through years of displacement. The American sailors aboard were young, most of them teenagers themselves. They had been told to maintain distance, to be professional, but they couldn't help noticing the way the women flinched at sudden movements, how they ate slowly, as if expecting the food to be taken away. Another made sure fresh water was always available. Small gestures, but they registered. When land finally appeared on the horizon, no one celebrated. The women pressed against the portholes, staring at a country they had been taught to fear. The coast looked impossibly clean, impossibly prosperous. Buildings stood intact. Cars moved freely on roads. There were no ruins, No bomb craters, no skeletal remains of what had once been homes. The contrast was jarring. Texas greeted them with heat. Dry, relentless, suffocating heat. They were loaded onto buses and driven through endless stretches of flat land dotted with cattle and mesquite trees. Children on bicycles waved at the buses as they passed. One woman pressed her palm against the window, unable to reconcile the scene with everything she had been told. This was supposed to be a nation of savages. Instead, it looked like a place where people lived ordinary lives. Fort Sam Houston sprawled across thousands of acres. The processing center was located near the southern edge. Inside, rows of cots had been set up, each with a folded blanket and a pillow. Real beds, not straw mats, not concrete floors, actual beds with frames. The women stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. One reached out tentatively and touched the edge of a blanket, then pulled her hand back as if burned. Another sat down slowly, testing the mattress beneath her. The guards left them alone. No one locked the doors. No one stood watch inside. The women could hear cattle lowing in the distance, the faint sound of a harmonica playing somewhere beyond the barn. The normalcy of it was more terrifying than any threat could have been. That first night no one slept. They lay in the darkness, listening to unfamiliar sounds, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One woman whispered a prayer. Another clutched her blanket so tightly her knuckles went white. They had survived the war, survived the journey, but this kindness felt like a trap. Morning came with a knock. 3 soft taps on the barn door, followed by a pause. A cowboy entered, hat in hand, carrying a wooden crate. Inside were bars of soap, towels, and small packages wrapped in cloth. He set the crate down gently and backed away, as if approaching a wild animal. No one moved. Finally, one woman stood and walked over. She picked up a bar of soap and brought it to her nose. It smelled clean, fresh, real. Within minutes, others approached. They unwrapped the cloth packages to find combs, toothbrushes, small tins of salve. One woman found a handkerchief with embroidered flowers and burst into tears. These were not the tools of humiliation. These were offerings of basic human dignity. The first meal arrived an hour later. 10 plates piled with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and something they didn't recognize, grits. The women stared at the food, unsure if it was safe to eat. One finally took a bite, chewed slowly, then nodded to the others. It wasn't poisoned. It was just food. Hot, abundant, freely given. Over the following days, a routine emerged. The women were given tasks, if they wanted them: laundry, cooking, tending to chickens. But the key phrase, what? Choice was a foreign concept. For years they had been told what to do, when to move, how to behave. Now American soldiers were asking, not ordering. One cowboy spent an afternoon teaching a small group how to collect eggs without frightening the hens. He moved slowly, demonstrating with exaggerated care. When one woman accidentally cracked an egg, he simply smiled and showed her again. No punishment, no reprimand, just patience. Language barriers created moments of awkward comedy. A soldier tried to explain howdy, using elaborate hand gestures. Another attempted to teach them poker, dealing cards and pointing enthusiastically at the different suits. The women watched, bewildered, then slowly began to mimic the game. When one of them won a hand, she looked around nervously, as if expecting to be punished for succeeding. But perhaps the most profound shift came with the mirror. Someone no one knew who hung a full-length mirror outside the mess hall. The first woman to see it stopped dead in her tracks. She had not seen her full reflection in over 3 years. She stared at herself, at the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her dress hung loose on her frame, the small scar above her eyebrow she didn't remember getting. Others gathered. They stood before the mirror in silence, rediscovering themselves. One woman reached up and touched her own face, as if confirming she was real. Another began to cry, not from sadness, but from the shock of recognition. They were still here. They had survived. The mirror became a ritual. Every morning women would stop by to brush their hair, to tuck a flower behind an ear, to practice smiling. They began to care for their appearance, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, a reclaiming of self. Ribbons appeared, some homemade, some gifted by the rancher's young daughter. Braids were woven. Faces were washed with deliberate care. The cowboys watched this transformation with quiet respect. They didn't understand all of it, but they recognized healing when they saw it. One left small packets of tea by the barn door. Another made sure there were always fresh wildflowers in a jar near the wash basin. These weren't grand gestures. They were acknowledgments of humanity. Medical checkups were handled with extraordinary care. The women had expected invasive examinations, rough handling. Instead, doctors knocked before entering, explained every procedure, and stopped immediately if a woman showed distress. One medic spent 20 minutes simply sitting beside a woman who was too frightened to be touched, waiting until she nodded her consent. When he finally examined her infected foot, he worked so gently she barely felt it. Letters became a bridge to the outside world. The women were given paper and pencils, told they could write home if they wished. Most stared at the blank pages for hours. What could they say? How could they explain that their captors had given them dresses and soap, that they were being treated with a kindness that felt impossible? One woman wrote 4 words, "I am still alive." She couldn't bring herself to write more. Another filled pages with descriptions of the ranch, the food, the strange men in hats who said, "Ma'am," and tipped their brims in greeting. A third wrote nothing at all, simply folded her blank page and left it with the others, a testament to words that couldn't be found. The letters were sent. Some reached their destinations. Others were lost in the chaos of post-war Japan, but the act of writing them mattered. It meant the women had voices again, even if those voices trembled on the page. Music became another language. A cowboy with a banjo played every evening, soft melodies that drifted across the property. The women would stop whatever they were doing and listen, drawn to the sound like moths to flame. One evening, a woman hummed along. The next night, another joined. Soon a small chorus of voices rose into the Texas twilight Japanese melodies woven into American chords, creating something entirely new. The day one of the women laughed out loud, everything changed. It happened during a game of cards. She had just won a hand through sheer luck and blurted out a laugh before she could stop herself. She immediately covered her mouth, eyes wide with fear. But the cowboys around the table just grinned. One of them tipped his hat. Another dealt the next hand. The laughter was allowed. More than that, it was welcomed. Slowly the women began to walk beyond the barn. Not to escape, but to explore. They walked through the pastures, feeling grass beneath their feet, watching cattle graze, breathing air that smelled of earth and growth. The guards didn't follow. There were no fences tall enough to cage them, no watchtowers monitoring their movements. They were free to wander, and that freedom was more disorienting than any prison could have been. They picked wildflowers and wove them into their hair. They sat in the shade of oak trees and spoke about things other than survival, about memories, about dreams, about what might come next. One woman admitted she wanted to learn English properly. Another said she missed the sea. A third confessed she didn't know if she could ever go home, not after everything. The Americans never pushed them to forgive, never demanded gratitude. They simply continued their routines, offering food, providing medical care, respecting boundaries. It was this consistency that slowly eroded the walls of fear. The women began to realize that this wasn't a performance. The cowboys weren't waiting for an audience to stop watching so they could reveal their true nature. This was their true nature. Trust came in increments. A woman accepted a second helping of food without fear. Another asked for help mending a torn dress. A third approached a guard to point out a sick chicken, using gestures and broken English until he understood. These small interactions built a foundation, brick by fragile brick. There were setbacks. One woman woke screaming from a nightmare and couldn't be calmed for hours. Another refused to eat for 3 days, convinced the food was poisoned, despite all evidence to the contrary. A third became violent when a medic approached too quickly, lashing out with fists and terror. The Americans didn't retaliate. They gave her space, left food within reach, and waited. Eventually, she emerged from her corner, shaking but no longer fighting. The psychological wounds were deeper than any physical injury. These women had been taught that their worth was tied to their usefulness, that their bodies were tools to be used and discarded. Undoing that programming took more than soap and dresses. It required time, patience, and a level of compassion that defied the logic of war. Months passed. The seasons shifted. The brutal Texas summer gave way to milder autumn air. The women learned English phrases, not just functional words, but expressions of preference and opinion. I like this. No, thank you. May I? Language became a tool of agency, allowing them to articulate needs and desires that had been suppressed for years. Some of the women began teaching the cowboys basic Japanese. They wrote characters in the dust, pronounced words slowly, laughed when the Americans mangled the pronunciation. These exchanges created a cultural bridge, however rickety, between two groups that were supposed to be enemies. When word came that the women would be relocated again, the atmosphere in the barn shifted. Fear returned, but it was different now, less about survival, more about loss. They had grown accustomed to this place, to these strange, gentle men who had shown them a version of America that contradicted every warning they'd ever received. Departure came at dawn. Trucks idled as the women gathered what little they owned, issued dresses, worn combs, rewritten letters, a harmonica, a ribbon. Small anchors to prove their time here was real. The cowboys stood in silence, hats in hand. No speeches, no promises. Just quiet respect as the women climbed into the trucks. A few looked back at the pasture and the men who had redefined the word enemy. Dust rose. The ranch blurred into memory. No one cried. Tears were a luxury. They held their tokens close and faced futures they couldn't predict. At Fort Sam Houston, Nothing historic happened, yet everything did. In a world shattered by war, a few Texas cowboys chose decency, not for reward or recognition, just because it felt right. Some women returned to Japan to ruins. Others built new lives in America. Many never spoke of Texas. Those who did remembered dresses instead of degradation, combs instead of cruelty. History records battles and leaders, but forgets small mercies. These women weren't traditional heroes. They simply survived being dehumanized, then survived being treated like humans again. The cowboys weren't saints, just men choosing kindness, one simple act at a time.